He lived in a quiet street where the houses were lined neatly, and the lawns were kept tidy. From the outside, his home looked like any other, simple and calm. The kind of place people drove past without giving a second thought. He liked it that way. Peace meant a lot to him. He wasn't looking for trouble, and he certainly didn't advertise himself. People in the neighborhood knew him as polite, friendly when spoken to, but mostly private. He didn't host parties or join in neighborhood gossip. He kept his life simple, and that suited him just fine. Every morning he would wake up before the sun rose. The quiet hours were his favorite. He brewed coffee, strong and black, and sat by the window looking out at the street. The world felt softer at that time, calmer. He noticed little things that others ignored. The way the wind moved through the trees. The way a single bird would land on a fence and chirp before flying away. Life had a rhythm for him, and he followed it carefully. Even small changes were noticed. He worked from home mostly, handling tasks that required focus and patience. Some of his neighbors didn't know what he did exactly, and he didn't mind. Curiosity was fine, but he had no need to share everything. He kept himself busy with work, his house, and his routines. Gardening was one of his hobbies. He had a small garden in the backyard, flowers and vegetables growing under his careful watch. Planting and watching life grow gave him a sense of control, a small bubble of peace in a world that was often unpredictable. Despite his quiet nature, he was aware of the subtle tension in the neighborhood. He noticed the looks sometimes, the way certain people avoided eye contact. He noticed small things on the news about hate incidents in nearby towns, people being targeted simply because of who they were. It didn't affect him personally most of the time, but he understood it could escalate. He always stayed aware, always prepared. Awareness didn't mean fear. It meant readiness. Some nights he would walk around his property, checking doors and windows. The fences were strong, the locks secure. Nothing about his home suggested weakness. Yet he never wanted to be noticed for what he could do. He was strong, trained, capable, but he didn't parade it. That was his way. Those who underestimated him thought he was just a quiet man, a man who wouldn't react if confronted. They had no idea what lay beneath that calm surface. On a Saturday morning, he noticed something strange. A group of young men had been hanging around the end of the street the day before, loitering near houses, speaking in low voices, throwing occasional glances toward his property. He observed from the window, calm, calculating. Their behavior was unusual for the normally quiet street. They weren't neighbors, and they didn't belong. They seemed curious, watching more than necessary. He didn't panic. He didn't even move yet. He simply watched, taking note of their behavior. That evening, as he walked his small dog along the sidewalk, he noticed graffiti on a nearby wall, hateful words and symbols painted in bright, angry colors. The sight made his stomach tighten slightly, but his face remained neutral. He bent down, picking up the leash, and continued walking. He didn't react in public, not yet. There was a time for calm and observation, and a time for action. He understood the difference. Most people reacted immediately, out of fear or anger, and that made situations worse. He had learned patience, and it served him well. His neighbors noticed him more than usual that day. A few waved, a few nodded, but some avoided looking at him entirely. That didn't bother him. The world was full of people who didn't understand one another. What mattered was staying grounded, staying calm, staying alert. He had faced chaos before, in ways no one could imagine, and he knew the signs of danger even when they were small. A broken fence, a trash can moved slightly from where it should be, an unfamiliar car parked at the end of the street. Small things told stories. He could read them better than most. By nightfall, he felt a sense of unease. Something in the air was different. The wind seemed sharper, carrying a tension he couldn't ignore. He didn't sleep that night, not fully. He moved through his home, checking windows and doors, making sure everything was as secure as it could be. His dog sensed it too, pacing slightly, ears perked. Calmness was one thing, but awareness was another. He stayed awake until the sounds of the street faded, until the quiet felt right again. Only then did he sit by the window, drinking coffee, watching the shadows dance across the empty street. During these quiet moments, his mind wandered back to his past. He didn't share much about it. Most people didn't know he had been a Navy SEAL. They didn't know the missions he had been part of, the dangers he had faced, or the training that had made him into someone extraordinary. It was a past he carried with humility, not pride. He didn't talk about it because he didn't need to. He had learned to act, not to boast. His skill set was not for show. It was for protection, for readiness, for survival, and he had survived things most could never imagine. He had also learned that calm was powerful. Chaos often made people careless, angry, or reckless. He had seen it countless times. Now, living a quiet life, he relied on that calm, on that experience to navigate a world that could sometimes be unpredictable and cruel. He didn't want trouble, but he understood how to face it if it came. His strength wasn't loud. It was silent, steady, controlled. That week, small incidents began to escalate. Broken mailboxes on the street, graffiti appearing on walls, strange cars parked for hours. Each time he observed silently, noting the details, license plates, faces, patterns. He was building a mental map of who might be responsible. His neighbors whispered among themselves, worried about what was happening, but he didn't join the chatter. He didn't need to. Observation was more useful than speculation. One evening, he noticed a group of men loitering near his driveway. They were young, angry, and loud. He stepped outside not to confront but to watch. They laughed and shouted hateful words, thinking no one noticed them. He remained still in the shadows, unseen. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He didn't move quickly, didn't act impulsively. He simply took mental notes, remembering every detail. Faces, voices, clothing, even the way they laughed, nothing escaped him. He returned inside, closing the door silently behind him. He didn't sleep that night either. He planned, he strategized, but he remained calm. He made sure everything in his home was secure. Lights positioned to create visibility. Cameras in place to record anything unusual. He didn't want to overreact. But he didn't want to be unprepared either. His training told him that preparation was key, that awareness was survival. As the days passed, tension grew. He could sense it in the street, in the nervous looks from neighbors, in the way the group of men moved with increasing boldness. It was coming, he knew it. The calm before the storm had ended, and now the storm itself was approaching. But he remained steady. Fear did not control him. He had faced worse. He had survived worse. And he would survive this too. He made a final round of checks one night, walking through each room, testing the locks, looking at the windows, imagining possible scenarios. He didn't panic. He prepared. He had done this countless times before, though never in his own home. But the principles were the same. Control your environment, stay aware, anticipate the moves of others, and always have a plan. His plan didn't involve revenge or anger. It involved safety, observation, and being ready to act if necessary. Sitting by the window again, he sipped his coffee and looked out at the dark street. The lights from the lampposts cast long shadows across the pavement. The air was tense. He could feel it. He didn't know exactly when the next move would come, but he knew it would. And when it did, he would be ready. Calm, silent, prepared, capable. Those who thought they could intimidate him had no idea. They had never met someone like him. And they would learn soon enough, though perhaps not in the way they expected. The night arrived quietly at first, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He had prepared for this moment, though he had hoped it would never come. Sitting by the window, he sipped coffee, listening to the soft rustle of leaves outside. The street looked empty, calm, but he could feel the tension. Something was coming, and he could sense it with every instinct he had honed over years of training. It began with the sound of laughter, loud, cruel, and rough. He froze for a moment, listening carefully. It wasn't normal laughter, the kind that comes from happiness. This was meant to unsettle, to intimidate. His eyes scanned the street through the window, catching shadows moving under the dim light of the street lamps. The group was larger than he expected. They were wearing hooded jackets, some masks, their faces partially hidden, but he could see enough to know who they were. The same men he had noticed days ago, but now joined by others. They carried bats, crowbars, and bottles. The mob approached his house slowly, deliberately, like predators circling their prey. He didn't panic. His heart beat steadily, controlled. He had been in situations far worse, though never in his own home. He stayed in the shadows, silent, calm, observing every move. They didn't know he was watching. They didn't know the man they thought was quiet and weak had trained for scenarios far more dangerous than this. The first sounds of destruction were subtle. Trash cans tipped over, a mailbox smashed. Then came the shouts, the taunting, the hateful words hurled against the quiet night. He could hear them calling out insults, slurs meant to provoke fear and submission. Their plan was simple: scare, intimidate, make him feel powerless. Most people would have panicked, but he didn't. He stayed still, listening, watching, calculating. One of the men kicked the front door. It splintered slightly but held. He could see them through the small crack at the top of the door, laughing and pushing against it. He felt a surge of controlled anger, not blind rage. He knew what could happen if they gained entry. His mind raced through possibilities, escape routes, safe positions, defensive moves. But he didn't act impulsively. Acting too soon would ruin the advantage he held. The mob moved to the windows next, smashing panes with crowbars and rocks. Glass shattered, spraying across the floor. The sound echoed sharp and jarring, meant to shock and frighten. He didn't flinch. He remained silent, noting every face, every movement, every detail. They were chaotic, uncoordinated, and overconfident. That overconfidence was their weakness. Outside, they tore through his garden, stepping on flowers, breaking plants, overturning pots. He felt a pang of sadness at the destruction of something he had nurtured for months, but it was quickly replaced by focus. He had faced loss before, larger and more personal. This was nothing compared to what he had endured. He reminded himself, stay calm, observe, survive. The chaos outside would only teach him more about them. Neighbors peeked cautiously from behind curtains, whispers passing through the street. A few tried to intervene from a distance, shouting for them to stop, but the mob ignored them. They believed no one was truly paying attention, that they could act with impunity. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He moved quietly through the house, keeping low, staying in positions that gave him visibility without exposure. Every step was deliberate, silent. His dog, sensing the tension, stayed close, ears twitching, muscles tense. He spoke softly to it, reassuring it with calm words. Even his dog knew something was wrong. Animals sense what humans often ignore. The mob's energy escalated. They broke into the garage, smashing doors, kicking cars, overturning tools. Their movements were aggressive but unplanned. They had strength but no discipline. He observed patterns, the way one man moved to distract while another struck at the property. He remembered every detail. Every mistake they made would count later. At one point, they tried to break into the side door. He had reinforced it earlier, and it barely budged. Frustration crept into their voices. One of them screamed, cursing at the empty house, not knowing someone inside was watching and waiting. The sound of anger gave him more clarity. They were not strategists. They were impulsive. Impulsiveness could be controlled, anticipated, turned against them if necessary. He didn't feel fear. He felt the calm awareness that had carried him through missions where lives hung by a thread. He knew that if he acted too early, they could escape or gain the upper hand. He wanted them exposed, accountable, caught in their own recklessness. Every movement he made now was about observation, about learning, about maintaining control in chaos. Then came the most chaotic moment. One of them tried to set fire to the front porch using a small bottle of flammable liquid. The flames were small but dangerous. He noted the position, the way the wind could carry sparks, the potential for harm. He didn't panic. He stayed still, planning his next move, calculating how the situation could be contained without unnecessary risk. The mob continued their attack, thinking they were victorious. They screamed, laughed, threw things, believing he was powerless. Each moment they spent destroying his home, each reckless move was a mistake. They had underestimated him completely. They had assumed quiet meant weakness. They had no idea the man inside had survived situations that would terrify them, that he had skills they could never dream of. He watched them for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. He stayed in control, his mind sharp, analyzing every angle. The sounds of breaking glass, splintering wood, and shouting filled the night, but he remained silent. He did not engage. There was no need. Engagement without planning would have been foolish. Patience was his advantage. Finally, the mob grew tired, overconfident, and careless. They taunted, thinking their intimidation had worked. One of them climbed onto the porch to shout insults directly at the house. That moment, he realized, was the turning point. They had revealed themselves fully, exposed their patterns, and shown the gaps in their coordination. He remembered every detail: who was where, who was distracted, who led the actions. Every piece of information was valuable. When they finally left, thinking they had succeeded, he remained in the shadows, still calm, still alert. The house was damaged, the garden ruined, but he was unbroken. The mob believed they had instilled fear, but they hadn't. He had learned, observed, and prepared. Their overconfidence and reckless behavior had given him insight. He knew who they were, where they lived, and the mistakes they had made. He surveyed the damage quietly, noting each broken window, each splintered door, each torn plant. He did not panic or shout. There was no crying or screaming. There was only a calm, deep awareness of what had happened and what could happen next. He made mental notes, repairs needed, evidence collected, patterns recognized. He was already planning his next steps methodically, strategically. Neighbors came out slowly after the mob left, whispering among themselves, shocked at what had happened. He stepped outside for a moment, surveying the quiet street, the shattered pieces of his home. He spoke gently to a few neighbors, reassuring them it was under control, though inside he knew the situation required careful handling. Panic was never productive. Strategy was. That night he sat again by the window, drinking coffee, thinking about the events. His house had been attacked by people driven by hate, by fear, by ignorance. Yet he remained calm, unshaken, fully aware. He didn't feel the need to retaliate immediately. He would act, but only when the time was right, when he had the advantage, when every move was precise. The mob had underestimated him, and they would pay for that in ways they could never anticipate. He reflected on the irony of it all. People had thought him quiet, unremarkable, even weak, but inside he was disciplined, trained, and capable of things most people couldn't imagine. The mob had assumed chaos would scare him, but chaos was where he thrived. Chaos revealed the weaknesses of others, their mistakes, their impulses. He had learned to read those signs long ago. Tonight had proven his point. As dawn approached, he finally allowed himself a few moments of rest. The street was quiet again, the mob gone, the danger temporarily paused. But he remained alert. He had survived worse situations, faced threats far greater, and he knew that vigilance was never ending. The calm after the storm was a chance to reflect, to prepare, to plan. The battle had begun, but it was far from over. He looked out at the broken pieces of his home and felt a deep resolve. He would restore his house, yes, but more importantly, he would ensure accountability. The people who had attacked his home would not escape the consequences of their actions. They had underestimated him completely. They had assumed quiet meant weakness. They had no idea that the man they had tried to intimidate was someone trained to survive, trained to act, trained to turn chaos into control. And soon they would learn that lesson. The morning after the attack was quiet but heavy. The street seemed different somehow, as if it had absorbed the chaos of the night before. Broken glass sparkled in the weak light of dawn, and the smell of scorched wood lingered faintly. He stepped outside, moving carefully over the debris, taking in the damage. His garden was torn apart, the fence splintered, windows shattered. The street had witnessed the violence, and the neighbors were still murmuring to each other behind closed curtains. He didn't rush to repair things. He walked slowly, noting every detail, cataloging what had happened. He touched the broken wood, felt the weight of the damage, but his mind was already moving forward. The attack had been aggressive, impulsive, and chaotic. That recklessness was a gift in its own way. It revealed more than the mob realized. He studied each splintered plank, each broken plant, and every mark on the walls. There were patterns, weaknesses, and mistakes to be remembered. It was then, in the calm light of morning, that memories of his past began to surface more vividly. He had kept his old life buried, unspoken. Few knew he had been a Navy SEAL, and he had wanted it that way. He had learned to carry the weight of experience silently. Most people never realized how much discipline and skill it took to survive what he had survived. He had been trained to read environments, to notice small details, to anticipate moves before they happened. Everything happening now was familiar in its essence, even if the setting was his own home. He thought back to the grueling training, the endless drills, the missions where failure was not an option. He remembered nights in the dark, moving silently through enemy territory, reading threats invisible to the untrained eye. He remembered the focus it took to remain calm under fire, to calculate every move, to stay alive when everything around him was chaos. It was the discipline he carried now in the quiet of his street that allowed him to face what had happened without panic. He also remembered the sense of responsibility that came with his training. He had been taught that skill alone was not enough. Awareness, patience, strategy. These were what separated those who survived from those who did not. And tonight he realized he would need all of it. The attack had been a warning, a show of force meant to intimidate. But they had underestimated him completely. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He returned inside, closing the door quietly behind him, and began his methodical work. First came the evidence. He photographed every piece of damage, noting angles, distances, and details that could be important later. Every mark, every broken item, every graffiti symbol was documented. He knew that careful records could make the difference between impunity and accountability. It was a skill from his past life, now applied to a new kind of mission. Next, he considered the people responsible. He had seen their faces clearly during the attack. He remembered the sounds of their voices, the way they moved, even the way they laughed at their own destruction. Those observations were not just memories, they were tools. He could piece together who they were, what patterns they followed, and what their weaknesses were. He didn't need to guess. Observation had always been his strength. As he worked, he felt a mixture of emotions: anger at the violation of his home, sadness at the destruction of the life he had built, and a deep, steady resolve. He didn't want revenge in the moment. He wanted justice. He wanted accountability. He wanted the people responsible to face the consequences of their actions. That required patience, strategy, and control. Acting out of emotion would only ruin the advantage he had. He moved to his garage, checking his equipment and supplies. In his previous life, preparation had been everything. Now it was just as important. He made a plan to restore his home, yes, but he also began planning his approach to the mob. He wasn't going to confront them recklessly. He would expose them, document them, and ensure that their actions could not continue unchecked. It was a measured response, not a reaction fueled by fear or anger. Throughout the day, he reflected on how the attack had unfolded. The mob had been loud and disorganized. They had overestimated their strength, underestimated his presence, and revealed more than they realized. Each misstep they had made was an opportunity. He cataloged it all, forming a mental map of their behavior, noting the divisions between them, the moments when they were distracted, and the ways they showed confidence that could later be manipulated. Neighbors began to emerge, cautiously at first. Some came to offer help, bringing small tools or covering broken windows temporarily. He acknowledged them politely, but he kept control of the situation. He didn't need assistance, not yet. Observation and control were his priority. The people who had attacked his home needed to feel the consequences, not escape into the anonymity of chaos. As evening approached, he began testing security measures. Cameras were repositioned, doors reinforced, and lights strategically placed. He considered every potential entry point, every angle the mob might attempt to exploit. Every precaution was made, not out of paranoia, but out of experience. In his past life, preparation had meant survival. Now it meant justice. He also began thinking strategically about the psychological side of the situation. The mob believed they had intimidated him. They thought his silence meant weakness. That was their first mistake. He knew that perception was powerful. If they believed he was passive, they would continue to act recklessly. If they thought he was aware and capable, even subtly, it would alter their behavior. He would use that advantage. Late at night, he revisited memories of his missions. He recalled times when he had moved silently, observed for hours, and struck only when the time was perfect. The principles were the same now: patience, awareness, strategy, and timing. The environment had changed, but the rules of engagement had not. He understood that every action he took now needed to be deliberate, measured, and purposeful. He spent hours reviewing the photographs of the damage, replaying what he had seen during the attack in his mind. Every movement of the mob, every pattern, every weakness. He did not dwell on fear or anger. He dwelled on facts, on opportunities, on strategy. His training had taught him to turn chaos into information. That is exactly what he was doing. The night deepened, and he finally allowed himself a moment to sit quietly. His dog curled at his feet, sensing the tension but relaxed in his calm presence. He reflected on the irony. The very people who had come to intimidate him had unknowingly revealed everything he needed to take control. They thought they were the predators, but in reality, they had walked straight into the observation of someone who had survived far more dangerous situations. By the early hours of the morning, he had formed a complete plan. It wasn't violent. He didn't want unnecessary confrontation. His goal was accountability. He would gather evidence, identify patterns, expose the mob, and ensure that justice followed. His methods would be precise, controlled, and effective. The mob had acted recklessly. That recklessness would be their undoing. He also reflected on the lessons he had learned from his past. Strength was not shown through intimidation or loud action. True strength was calm, measured, and deliberate. It was knowing when to act and when to wait. It was awareness of oneself and the environment, and in that quiet, he felt the reassurance that he was ready for what came next. The morning sun began to break through the blinds, spilling light across the damaged floor. He looked at the house around him and felt no despair. He felt clarity. He had seen the threat, understood it, and was preparing to respond in the most effective way possible. The chaos of the night before had been a test. He had passed. Now the next phase was beginning. Neighbors moved cautiously through the street, still wary of what had happened. Some whispered about the man inside the house, wondering why he had not reacted violently. They did not understand that calm and awareness were more powerful than anger. They did not know he had the skill to act decisively if necessary, and that he was already planning a measured response that would change everything. By mid-morning, he began organizing his thoughts, creating a clear picture of the sequence of events, identifying the people involved, and noting the mistakes they had made. Every piece of evidence, every detail he had observed was part of a larger strategy. He did not rush. He did not act impulsively. The mob had shown their weakness. Now it was his advantage to use that weakness wisely. As the day passed, he felt a quiet satisfaction in his clarity. The world outside might have been chaotic, unpredictable, and full of hate, but inside he had control. He had awareness. He had strategy. And most importantly, he had patience. The mob had believed that noise and destruction were power. He knew that true power was control, preparation, and timing. The evening arrived and he reviewed everything one last time. The evidence, the observations, the patterns, and the lessons from his past. He understood that the next step would require precision. He would not act out of emotion. He would not act impulsively. The next step would be deliberate, controlled, and effective. The mob had made the first mistake, they had revealed themselves. He would make the second, they would face the consequences. He sat quietly by the window, coffee in hand, looking at the street that had been the site of chaos just hours before. The calm after the storm was different now. It carried purpose. It carried planning. It carried the quiet determination of someone who had faced far worse and survived. He was ready. And soon, those who had attacked his home would understand that calm, observation, and strategy were far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. The days after the attack were quiet, but he could feel the tension in the air. The street seemed to be holding its breath as if waiting for the next move. He moved carefully through his home, repairing minor damages, reinforcing doors and windows, and setting up surveillance equipment. Every detail mattered. Every angle, every corner, every possible point of entry was carefully monitored. He didn't act out of fear. He acted out of preparation, strategy, and a deep sense of responsibility. He spent hours reviewing the evidence he had collected. Photographs, videos, observations, everything was cataloged, organized, and studied. The mob had revealed themselves fully during the attack. Their faces, their movements, even their voices were recorded. They had made mistakes, and mistakes could be used against them. He didn't feel joy in their failure or harm in his advantage. It was simply the result of awareness, patience, and careful planning. The first step was to understand them. He mapped their patterns, their usual haunts, and the times when they were most active. Some of them were reckless, often moving in groups without planning. Others seemed to follow blindly, letting the stronger voices lead. Each personality, each habit was noted. He could anticipate their actions because he understood human behavior, trained to read even the smallest signals. He also considered the psychology of the situation. The mob believed they had power, that their intimidation had worked. They did not know they were being watched, documented, and analyzed. Perception mattered. If they believed they were untouchable, they would continue to make mistakes. If they thought they were being observed by someone capable, they would hesitate, and hesitation could be used. He was creating a situation where the consequences of their actions would become unavoidable. He started small. At first, he simply repositioned cameras and sensors to cover blind spots. Lights were adjusted to improve visibility at night. Motion detectors were tested. He wanted the mob to know subtly that the house was no longer defenseless without showing them the full extent of his preparation. Every small measure sent a message. Chaos was no longer theirs to control. He also used technology to his advantage. Video evidence from multiple angles, timestamps, and sound recordings created a clear record of the attack. He did not plan to confront the mob physically yet. That would come later only if necessary. First, he would gather proof, build a clear picture, and make sure that when action was taken it would be precise and undeniable. In the meantime, he repaired what he could. The broken windows were reinforced, plants replanted, and debris cleared. His home began to feel like a sanctuary again, a place of control rather than chaos. He moved quietly, deliberately, never rushing, never acting impulsively. He understood that haste could create mistakes, and mistakes could give the mob an advantage. Patience was key. One evening, he noticed movement outside. The same group of men had returned, perhaps to test, perhaps to intimidate further. They did not see him at first. He observed silently, noting who led, who followed, who seemed distracted, and who spoke the most. Their patterns were familiar now. They had revealed everything during the first attack, and they continued to show their weaknesses. He did not move, did not shout, did not engage. He only watched and recorded. He used that opportunity to reinforce his plan. The mob's overconfidence was their greatest weakness. They believed they could act without consequence, and that belief would be their undoing. He began creating a timeline of their habits, mapping where they went and what they did at certain hours. This was not surveillance out of fear. It was strategy, a way to ensure that when the time came to hold them accountable, there would be no room for doubt or escape. Neighbors remained cautious, whispering about the man inside the house. Some wondered why he had not confronted the mob directly, why he had not fought back in the moment. They did not understand that his strength was silent, controlled, and precise. It was patience, awareness, and strategy that made him dangerous, far more than anger or impulsive action. The mob had underestimated him completely. That underestimation would be decisive. He began to plan the next steps carefully. Legal action would be one avenue. Evidence collected would be presented to authorities in a way that could not be ignored. Social accountability was another tool. The mob's actions had been reckless and public. He could use that recklessness against them, exposing their behavior to the community, ensuring they could not continue to act without consequence. He also began thinking tactically about the environment. The street, the neighborhood, the layout of houses, all of it mattered. He positioned lights, cameras, and other measures to create visibility and control. Each measure was subtle, unnoticed, but effective. He did not want confrontation yet. He wanted the mob to continue showing their weakness, to continue revealing themselves. Their arrogance was their weapon, and he intended to turn it against them. Days passed with careful observation. He noticed small things. The way they walked down the street, the times they gathered, the signals they gave to each other. He noted patterns, distractions, and vulnerabilities. This information would be crucial when the moment came to hold them accountable. Patience was not passive. It was preparation, calculation, and control. He also reflected on the psychological toll of the situation. Living in fear or anger would be easy, but it would cloud judgment. He reminded himself constantly to remain calm, to focus on facts, and to act only when it was necessary and advantageous. His training had taught him that the mind was as important as the body. The ability to stay composed under pressure would ensure success far more than impulsive action ever could. One evening, he noticed a few of the men attempting to provoke neighbors. They were loud, aggressive, trying to show dominance, believing no one was observing them. He did not intervene directly, but he documented everything carefully. Every word, every gesture, every movement became part of the record. They thought they were in control. They were not. He also began contacting authorities, not in anger, but with careful preparation. The evidence was presented calmly, clearly, and thoroughly. The photographs, videos, and detailed observations created a strong case. His goal was accountability, not vengeance. Justice could be achieved through clarity, evidence, and strategy. Acting impulsively would only give the mob a chance to adapt or escape. Patience ensured precision. He continued to reinforce his home, checking every window, door, and entry point. He adjusted cameras to cover new angles, repositioned lights, and added subtle security measures that were not immediately visible. He did not want to intimidate directly, but he wanted control. Every step he took was deliberate, methodical, and strategic. The mob's recklessness had given him advantage, and he intended to use it fully. Neighbors began to notice the change. The street felt different, more cautious, more alert. The mob's confidence seemed to waver slightly, as though they sensed something they could not see. He did not interact with them, did not confront them. He simply remained vigilant, observing and documenting. Their paranoia, subtle though it was evidence of his control. He also worked on restoring parts of the home that could be fixed quickly. Broken items were repaired, gardens replanted, fences patched. This was more than just restoration. It was a psychological statement. The house was no longer a place of vulnerability. It was controlled, prepared, and resilient. He did not need to shout or fight. He had used strategy and awareness to regain control. Over the next few nights, the mob returned sporadically, testing boundaries, trying to provoke fear. Each time he observed, documented, and learned. Their patterns became predictable, their mistakes more obvious. Each moment they acted recklessly became an opportunity for accountability. He did not act out of fear or anger. He acted out of preparation, patience, and clarity. By the end of the week, he had mapped nearly every movement of the mob. He had documented every action, every voice, every visible behavior. His house was secured, his evidence organized, and his plan was clear. He had control. The mob's arrogance, recklessness, and overconfidence had become his advantage. He had turned chaos into information, confusion into clarity, and threat into strategy. He sat quietly by the window one night, coffee in hand, looking out at the street. The mob had shown themselves for what they were, impulsive, reckless, and foolish. The street had returned to a quiet calm, but it was a calm he controlled now. Every measure, every observation, every precaution was part of a plan that would ensure justice without unnecessary violence. The calm that had carried him through his Navy SEAL missions now carried him through this challenge. He knew the final phase was approaching. The mob could no longer act without consequences. The evidence was clear. The patterns were established. The strategy was in place. He would ensure accountability not through chaos or blind retaliation, but through precision, clarity, and control. Those who had attacked his home would soon realize that patience, observation, and preparation were far more dangerous than impulsive action or aggression. The day finally arrived when he knew the situation would change. The mob had grown bolder in the past week, but each action they had taken only provided him with more information, more clarity, and more control. He had spent hours observing, documenting, and planning, and now all the pieces were in place. This was not about anger or revenge. It was about justice, accountability, and demonstrating that recklessness and hatred carried consequences. He started early in the morning, reviewing everything once more. The photographs, videos, notes, and recorded sounds were all organized and precise. Each action of the mob, each reckless movement was documented in detail. He had prepared a full record, a timeline of events that left no room for ambiguity. If anyone questioned what had happened, the proof was undeniable. This level of preparation had always been key to his past missions, and it was just as important now. His home, though still showing signs of the previous attack, was fortified. Broken windows had been repaired or reinforced, doors strengthened, and cameras positioned to cover every angle. Subtle lights and sensors ensured that any movement outside would be detected. He had created an environment that was both controlled and observant. Anyone attempting to repeat their actions would immediately reveal themselves. Neighbors moved cautiously along the street that morning, some still whispering about what had happened. He acknowledged them with a calm nod, showing no sign of fear or tension. That calmness itself sent a subtle message. The situation was under control, and the chaos they had expected would not return. He had regained the power over his environment, and that power was rooted in strategy, patience, and awareness. He prepared to share the evidence with authorities. He had contacted them carefully, presenting his documentation in a calm,